The crack of wood against the dock sounded exactly like a slap. That is the only way I can describe it the moment my daughter-in-law's fist came down on the picnic table at Carol's lake house and told me, in front of 47 friends and family members gathered for my son's 40th birthday party, that she had already listed the property with a real estate broker, that I had no say in the matter, that the paperwork had been handled, that I should be grateful they had found me a very comfortable place in Clearwater, Florida, where the weather was pleasant and the staff was attentive. That Carol's lake house, the one her grandfather built in 1951, the one where she learned to swim, where she read every book she ever loved, where we held her memorial service just 3 years ago, was being sold to a developer who wanted to knock it down and build condominiums. I did not yell. I did not overturn the table. I simply set down my glass of iced tea and looked at the woman my son had married, and I said, very quietly, that she had made a serious mistake. She laughed at me. My name is Edward Marsh. Most people call me Ed. I am 64 years old, and for 37 of those years I designed buildings. Not the glass and steel kind that go up in 6 months and fall apart in 20. I designed structures that were meant to last: courthouses, libraries, hospital wings, university buildings that will still be standing when everyone in this story is long gone. I was good at it. More than good. I understood that the bones of a structure matter more than the facade. I understood that what you cannot see is often more important than what you can. Carol understood that too. She was a landscape architect. We met at a conference in 1987, arguing about whether a parking garage in downtown Detroit could be made beautiful. She said yes. I said probably not, but I was willing to be convinced. She spent 36 years convincing me that most things could be made beautiful if you cared enough and knew where to look. She passed away from pancreatic cancer 3 years ago last April. She died in the upstairs bedroom of the lake house she grew up in, with the window open so she could hear the water. She asked me to keep it. She made me promise. I kept that promise every single day until the evening my daughter-in-law announced she had already broken it on my behalf. My son was standing at the grill when it happened. He is 40 years old now, tall like me, with Carol's eyes, and I had long feared neither of our spines. He had been married to my daughter-in-law for 6 years. In those 6 years, she had systematically replaced every habit, preference, and opinion my son once held with her own. He no longer called me on Sundays. He no longer came to the lake house for Thanksgiving. He no longer went fishing, which he had loved since he was 7 years old. He had traded all of that for a condo in Scottsdale, a wardrobe that cost more than my first car, and a wife who referred to Carol's lake house as the liability property in the one conversation I had accidentally overheard 6 months ago. I had filed that away. I had told myself I was overreacting. My daughter-in-law was still talking when I stood up. She was explaining loudly, cheerfully, performing for the crowd, that they had found a wonderful community for me in Florida, that the weather would be good for my joints, that I would make friends, that Carol would have wanted me to be happy. She was using Carol's name like a key, like she knew what Carol would have wanted, like she had earned the right to speak for a woman she had met exactly 4 times before the funeral and twice after. I looked at my son. He was still at the grill. He was not looking at me. He was flipping a burger that did not need to be flipped, staring at the grate with the concentrated attention of a man pretending he is somewhere else. I sat back down. I picked up my iced tea. I looked out at the lake, at the late afternoon sun turning the surface of the water copper and gold, at the old willow on the east bank that Carol planted from a cutting when she was 19 years old. Then I said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, that the lake house was not for sale, that no broker had any legal authority to list it, and that anyone who told them otherwise had been lying. My daughter-in-law's smile did not waver. She reached into the canvas tote bag beside her chair and pulled out a manila envelope. She slid it across the picnic table toward me, with the confident elegance of someone who has rehearsed this moment many times. I looked at the envelope. I did not open it. I already knew what was inside because the account number on the brokerage transfer confirmation had appeared on my banking dashboard 2 weeks ago as an anomaly I had not yet had time to investigate. I had told myself it was probably nothing. I had been telling myself things were probably nothing for 6 years. I pushed the envelope back across the table without touching it, and told her the document inside would be explained to her in detail very soon by someone with a law degree. The party did not recover from that moment. The guests, neighbors, old colleagues, Carol's surviving friends from the Garden Society, went quiet in the way people go quiet when they realize the event they came to celebrate has shifted into something else entirely. My daughter-in-law launched into an explanation about my confusion, my age, my grief, my difficulty adjusting to Carol's absence. My son still did not turn around. The burger was burning. I excused myself, walked through the screen door into the kitchen, and called a number I had been carrying in my phone for 3 years without ever wanting to use. Before I tell you who answered that call and what she said, I want to tell you about the day after Carol's funeral, because without that day, none of what came next would have been possible. 3 years ago, 48 hours after we buried my wife, I sat in the office of an attorney named Margaret. She is 61 years old, a small woman with silver-streaked hair cut close to her head and the calm, precise manner of someone who has spent decades watching people make catastrophic decisions during moments of emotional vulnerability. She had been Carol's attorney first. Carol had used her to structure the inheritance of the lake house property, which had been in Carol's family for 70 years, and she had become mine in the months that followed. Margaret had sat across from me in her office and said, without any preamble, that grief makes people generous in ways they will later regret, and that people who love someone who is grieving sometimes exploit that generosity, not out of malice, but out of a very human certainty that they deserve what they are asking for. She had drafted what she called a generation preservation clause for the Lake House Trust. It was not complicated. It simply stated that the property could not be listed, sold, mortgaged, or transferred without the written consent of the founder of the trust, which was me, and the independent trustee, which was Margaret herself. Any attempt to do so without both signatures was not just null and void. It triggered an automatic audit of all financial instruments connected to the property, and granted the trustee emergency injunctive authority to halt the transaction and recover damages. We called it the anchor. Margaret said she hoped I would never need it. I signed the document in her office on a Tuesday morning while the world outside was ordinary and indifferent to the weight of what I was putting on paper. Now, standing in Carol's kitchen with the sounds of my son's birthday party drifting through the screen door, I told Margaret what had happened. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said 2 words I had not heard her say in 3 years of knowing her. She said, "I'm ready." She asked me to stay inside. She told me to be polite, be calm, and do not engage with the listing documents. She said she needed 45 minutes. I looked at the clock on the kitchen wall, the one Carol bought at a flea market in Vermont, with the slightly crooked minute hand, and I said fine. I went back outside. I rejoined the party, as if nothing had happened. I talked to Carol's old friends about the willow tree and the way the water level had dropped in a dry summer. I ate a piece of birthday cake. My daughter-in-law watched me from across the yard with the expression of a person who is certain they have won and is simply waiting for the other side to acknowledge it. My son eventually came and sat beside me on the old wooden bench at the edge of the dock, and we watched the water for a few minutes without speaking. He said he was sorry about how it had come out. He said the timing was bad. He said it had been a hard decision, but that they had talked about it a lot, and they really believed it was the right thing. He said the upkeep on the property was significant and that Florida would be good for me, that the community they had found had a lot of amenities, that I would not feel isolated. I asked him whether he had read the trust documents. He said the lawyer they had consulted had reviewed everything. I asked him which lawyer. He named a firm I did not recognize, in Scottsdale. He looked at me then, and for a brief moment I saw something pass across his face. Not guilt exactly, but the shadow of it, the outline of a feeling that had not yet fully formed. He looked like a man who had memorized the answers to a test and was now not sure those were the right answers. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Margaret. On my way, bringing 2 associates and the anchor documents. Also bringing the audit results from the title company. You should see what I found. I read the message twice. Then I asked my son, very calmly, whether his wife had mentioned anything to him about a home equity line they had apparently taken out against the lake house property 18 months ago. He stopped. He blinked. The shadow on his face deepened into something harder to name. I told him that the title audit Margaret had run, she ran one annually as part of the trust maintenance, a detail I had never mentioned to anyone because it had never seemed relevant, had flagged an instrument filed with the county recorder's office in his wife's name, using a property she did not own as collateral for a line of credit worth $250,000. I told him that the signature on the filing appeared to be mine. It was not mine. I had not signed anything related to that property in 3 years, except the anchor document in Margaret's office. My son's face went through several changes very quickly. The first was confusion. The second was a look I had seen before. The look of a man trying to construct an innocent explanation for something that does not have one. The third was a kind of stillness. The stillness that comes just before something large gives way. He said my wife's name, his wife's name, and it came out like a question. I told him he should probably wait until the attorney arrived to have that conversation. Margaret's car pulled into the gravel drive at precisely the 45-minute mark. She drives a dark gray sedan that is always slightly dusty from the unpaved roads around her office, and she was not alone. 2 associates got out of the car after her, both carrying document cases. They moved with the quiet efficiency of people who do this kind of thing regularly and find no drama in it. My daughter-in-law saw them from across the yard. I watched the certainty drain out of her face like water out of a punctured barrel. She crossed the lawn quickly, intercepting Margaret before she reached the dock. She used the word trespassing. She said this was a private party on private property, and that Margaret had no authority to be there. Margaret looked at her with the expression of a woman who has been told far more frightening things by far more frightening people and opened her briefcase. She handed my daughter-in-law a document. She explained, in the patient tone of someone reading a bedtime story to a child who does not entirely understand the language yet, that the property they were standing on was held in an irrevocable trust, of which she was the independent trustee, that the trust contained a generation preservation clause, which had been triggered 27 days ago, when an unauthorized listing agreement was filed with a brokerage firm in Phoenix, and that as a result, she had exercised her authority under Section 4B of the trust instrument to initiate emergency injunctive relief, halting the sale, recall the listing, notify the brokerage of the filing irregularity, and commission an independent title audit. She paused. She looked at my daughter-in-law over the top of the document. She said the title audit had been very interesting. My daughter-in-law said something about lawyers who worked for old men with nothing better to do. Her voice had changed. The confident, cheerful tone she had used at the picnic table was gone. What was underneath it was sharper and more frightened. Margaret did not respond to that. She turned to one of her associates, who opened a second case and removed a bound document, roughly 2 inches thick. Margaret took it and set it on the picnic table in the spot where my daughter-in-law had set the manila envelope an hour earlier. She said that the audit had uncovered not 1 but 3 separate instruments filed against the property using a notarized copy of my signature that I had not provided. A home equity line of credit for $250,000. A second lien used as collateral for a business loan taken out in the name of an LLC registered in Delaware called Hartwell Property Group, and a title transfer document that had been filed but not yet recorded, transferring an undivided interest in the property to Hartwell Property Group. She explained that Hartwell Property Group had 1 registered member. She looked at my daughter-in-law. She said the name. I watched my daughter-in-law look at my son. My son had not moved from the bench beside me. He was sitting very still, his hands flat on his knees, looking at the document on the table as if it were a living thing that might move. Some of the guests had begun quietly collecting their things. Others had not moved, held in place by the terrible magnetism of a moment they would describe to other people for years. My daughter-in-law shifted. The calculation I saw move across her face was not subtle. She had trained herself to be many things, charming, persuasive, strategically vulnerable. But she had not trained herself for this specific situation, which was being caught in a room with the actual paperwork. She said that she had been advised by their attorney that the trust was amendable and that my signature had been obtained properly. She said the word properly, the way people say words when they are no longer sure they mean them. She said that I had not been managing the property responsibly, and that she and my son had the family's best interests at heart. Margaret said that was a very interesting legal theory, and that she looked forward to hearing it explained to a judge. She said the forged signature issue would likely be handled by the county district attorney rather than a civil court, but that her office was prepared to assist with whichever process moved faster. My daughter-in-law said she was calling their lawyer. Margaret said that was an excellent idea and gestured toward the end of the dock, where there was good cell reception. She called him. She walked to the end of the dock and stood with her back to the party, speaking in a voice pitched too low to carry. I watched her shoulders tighten. I watched her turn around once and look at the document on the table. I watched her turn back to the water. The call lasted 4 minutes. When she came back, she did not look at Margaret. She looked at my son. What she said to him, I will not repeat in its entirety, because some of it is still being reviewed by attorneys, and some of it is simply not something I would pass along. The short version is this. She had believed the property was theirs by right of inevitability. She had believed that my son's relationship with me gave her access to assets she had decided she deserved. She had believed that grief makes people pliable, and that old men with no children at home eventually become their children's financial instruments, whether anyone acknowledges it or not. She said, loudly, that my son had known about the home equity line, that he had signed the paperwork willingly, that the money had paid for things they both enjoyed, that he was not an innocent party, and she was not going to be the only one standing in front of this problem. My son had gone the color of old chalk. He stood up from the bench beside me. He said her name. She said something back. He said it again, differently. She said she was done with this family and its legacy properties and its dead women's lake houses. And she walked off the dock, across the lawn, and into the house. And the screen door banged shut behind her. The remaining guests left very shortly after that. Margaret came and sat beside me on the bench where my son had been. She set down her briefcase. She looked at the willow tree on the east bank. She said nothing for a moment, which was one of the things I had always appreciated most about her. Then she said the criminal referral would be filed Monday. She said the injunction on the property was solid. She said the Hartwell LLC would be dissolved by the courts within 90 days. She said I should change the locks on the lake house that evening and document the condition of every room before anyone had the opportunity to remove anything. I asked her about my son. She said that depended on how cooperative he was and how much of the financial trail was in his name versus hers. She said it was not necessarily as clean as his wife had suggested. I told her I understood. She left. Her associates followed her. The document case is back in the car. The job done with the quiet efficiency with which it had arrived. I sat alone on the dock for a long time. The sun finished setting. The lake went from copper to gray to the deep. The particular blue it turns on clear summer nights. A blue that has no name in any color chart I have ever consulted. A blue that belongs only to this water at this hour. My son came and found me there around 9 o'clock. He had the look of a man who has been sitting with something very heavy and does not know how to put it down. He sat on the dock beside me with his feet hanging over the edge the way he used to when he was a child, and he did not say anything for a long time. When he spoke, he did not make excuses. I had not expected him to, and I was right. He explained things in the flat, careful way of someone who has given up on narrative and is trying only to be accurate. He said he had known about the home equity line. He said he had told himself it was technically legal because the attorney they hired had suggested the trust language was ambiguous and that his position as my son gave him implied authority over the property. He said he had allowed himself to be convinced of this because he wanted to believe it. He said that was a choice, and he knew it was a choice. I asked him whether he had known about the forged instruments. He was quiet for a moment, the honest kind of quiet, not the constructing kind. He said no. He said he had signed documents he had not read carefully enough because she had told him they were standard transfer documents and he had trusted her, and that trusting her instead of looking was also a choice, and he knew that too. I asked him one question that I had been carrying all evening. I asked him whether he had been part of the plan to move me to Florida. He said yes. He said he had told himself it was genuinely for my benefit. I told him that might have been partly true and that it did not make it less of a plan to remove me from the property they wanted to sell. He said he knew that. We sat without speaking for a while. The water made the small sounds water makes at night. I told him that I was not prepared to discuss the future of our relationship that evening, and that I was not sure how long it would take me to be prepared for that conversation. I told him I did not hate him. I told him that what he had done was not unforgivable in the sense that people use that word when they are finished, but that it would require more than an apology, and that I would need time, and he would need to demonstrate things rather than describe them. He said he understood. He said he was sorry. He said it the way you say something when you mean it, and no, it is not enough. He left that night. I do not know where he went. I did not ask. I slept in the upstairs bedroom with the window open. I changed the locks in the morning. In the weeks that followed, Margaret's office worked with efficiency and discretion. The criminal forgery referral moved through the district attorney's process with the momentum that well-documented cases develop. The Hartwell LLC was found to have been used to obscure approximately $340,000 in transactions over a period of 18 months, most of it flowing through accounts my daughter-in-law had opened, using the lake house as a stated asset. The brokerage firm, when presented with the title audit and the injunction documents, cooperated immediately and terminated the listing agreement. They also, Margaret informed me, filed their own complaint regarding the fraudulent representations made when the listing was initiated. My daughter-in-law hired an attorney. The attorney sent several strongly worded letters. Margaret responded to each one with the measured calm of a woman who keeps every document and loses no sleep. The process was slow and administrative and almost entirely devoid of drama, which is the way serious legal consequences usually work. Nothing like the movies. Just paper and time, and the gradual recognition that the story you told yourself does not match the record. My son cooperated with the investigation. This was significant, and it was not nothing. And Margaret said it was likely to matter when decisions were made about what charges to pursue and against whom. I did not influence that process. I let it move on its own. I spent the summer at the lake house. I painted the dock. I cleared the brush along the east bank that had been encroaching on Carol's willow for 2 years. I found her garden journals in the storage room, 12 of them, going back to 1989, filled with her handwriting and pressed plant samples and small observations about light and soil and the particular way certain afternoons felt. I sat on the dock and read them in order. From the first summer she brought me here, to the last summer she was well enough to be outside. I called a foundation attorney in September. The process took 3 months and required more paperwork than I had imagined. But by December, the Carol Marsh Environmental Design Fellowship was officially registered as a non-profit organization. Its purpose was to fund graduate students in landscape architecture and environmental design students from working-class backgrounds who had the talent and the drive, but not the money. The endowment came from assets I had restructured following the injunction, assets that had been intended for a different purpose and now had a better one. Margaret came to the lake house in January for a working lunch to review the foundation's governing documents. She sat at the kitchen table where I had been sitting the afternoon everything began, and she ate the soup I made and read through the papers and said the structure was sound. She asked me how I was. I told her that was a more complicated question than it used to be. She said that was probably a good sign, because simple answers to that question usually mean something is being avoided. I told her I had spoken to my son twice, once in October, for about 20 minutes, mostly logistical. Once in November, longer, harder, closer to what the actual conversation needed to be. We had not arrived anywhere definitive. I was not certain we would. He was living in a different city now, working for a firm that had no connection to anything I had built, which I thought was probably healthy. We spoke without the old pretenses, which was both better and more difficult than the pretenses had been. I told Margaret that I had come to understand something I had resisted understanding for years, which was that the love I had for my son and the damage he had helped cause were not opposites. They were the same story told from different directions. I loved him, and he had chosen badly. Not once, but in accumulated small ways that added up to the evening on the dock. And both of those things were true at the same time, and neither one canceled the other. She said that sounded right. I said, I did not know what came next. She said at 64. Not knowing what came next was the same as being free. I looked out the window at the lake. February ice at the edges, open water in the center, the willow bare but standing. Carol had planted that tree 45 years ago, from a cutting she carried in a jar of water on a 3-hour drive because she thought it would be beautiful here. She had been right. It was beautiful here. It had always been beautiful here, and it was still beautiful here, and it would be beautiful here long after every other part of this story had faded. I picked up my pen. Margaret had set the last document on the table in front of me. The deed amendment formally removing any disputed claim from the property record and restoring the trust to its original terms. I signed my name at the bottom, my actual name, in my actual handwriting, meaning exactly what it said. I handed it back to her. She looked at it once, nodded, and placed it in her briefcase. I said, "It is done." She said, "Yes." Outside, the lake was still. The willow was still. The afternoon light was the particular flat white of winter over water. And somewhere under the ice, the same fish were doing whatever fish do in February, the same slow, purposeful life continuing without reference to what the people above the surface have been doing to each other. I had built things that were meant to last. I had not always built the right things, but the house at the edge of this lake was still standing. The willow was still rooted in Carol's chosen ground, and the fellowship that carried her name would send its first students into the field next fall. I was 64 years old. I did not know what came next. I was beginning to think that was the point. If this story stayed with you, if you have ever watched someone you love choose greed over family, or if you have ever had to make the hardest decision out of love rather than anger, leave a comment below. Tell me what you would have done. And if you believe that dignity is worth protecting no matter the cost, subscribe to Revenge Chronicles. These stories matter, and so does the truth underneath them.